I can dimly remember a big black, highly polished anthracite coal stove, but I don't know. I probably was at the first house we moved to in 1912 at 206 Custer. Later we moved to 350 Chadwick Avenue during World War I into a flat, a nice one. And then when the war was over, my mother and father bought a house at 223 Custer, and I was married out of that house. My mother, your great-grandmother, was a splendid cook. A cousin of mine, when I was getting information about about the family history, wrote me and said, "Oh, I remember visiting you, and Aunt Ann was such a good cook." So raised to me, I had nothing but good meals all my life. I never went hungry. I say that advisedly. I had a good fellow I worked with, and his father was in the construction industry. I mean, he's just a worker. And he would tell me about the times they went hungry when work was scarce, went to bed hungry. My father belonged to a union. He had a steady job. His job was protected from vicarious firings and that sort of thing. In other words, it was a contract, and while he didn't make a great deal of money, it came, of course, he didn't drink. He was a teetotaler. And so the money was brought home faithfully every Friday. Incidentally, he was a Republican. Now, a very hard-nosed Republican, and you may wonder about that, since even in his day, most working men were Democrat. But he was also one other thing. He was a teetotaler. I mean, there was never any liquor in our house from one year's end to the other. I don't know why he was so hard-nosed on it. He wasn't critical of other people who drank. In fact, he'd make a point of saying, well, he's a very decent man. He does take a drop or two. Sometimes he'd say about someone they take a little too much. But whatever happened in his past life, he was an absolute teetotaler. And the Democratic Party was the Sloan Party. So that is why your great-grandfather DuPlessis was a Republican. My father, he loved to talk to people. He'd go out and hunt them. Remember, he died in 1936, and we had lived in Winston only a couple of years. I remember he would go out for a walk and then come back and tell me about this one he had met and that one he had met and so on. As far as labor was concerned, his labor stuff, he said very little, but I know he was active, and I know he was dedicated to organized labor. I used to read when I was your age. I used to read the Saturday Evening Post. Everybody did and took it home, and it was a scab paper. And he would ask me not to read it, but, he'd tell me it was a scab. Couldn't I find something else? He hated to have it in the house. And I never made a big issue of it, but I didn't stop reading it either. And he didn't make that much of an issue. But clothing that was bought everything that was bought, as far as possible, had a union label on it. So he was brought up in the days as a young man when this one famous American industrialist said, $1 a day is enough for any working man. And my father quoted that quite often. He learned his trade in the Oswego, New York Palladium, Palladium, I think, is how it's spelled. It is now Palladium hyphen something else. In other words, now a hyphenated name. But the paper's still in existence. Now, in those days, you spent 5 years, at least you did later, maybe in his days it was less time, and you worked learning your trade. You were an apprentice. And then when you learned your trade and were a full-fledged journeyman, you were out of a job. I mean, you would sign on as a sub at the paper where you would substitute worker at the paper where you had been working, or you would go out on the road and look for a job somewhere else. Now, that was a way of life. Once you were on at seniority, you could take a month off, or you wouldn't get paid for it. But you would get a substitute to work for you. Your job was always secure. They couldn't take it away from you. So they fuss a little bit about the rigidity and the extent of union rules, but they had a purpose. I don't have much to, in a way of recollections on the labor front. I remember as a kid going to union meetings. Apparently there must have been an annual meeting or something, because my father got it. It was a theater, and this one meeting was in a theater in Newark. My father got up and made a speech, and so now my father, during the whole time he was married, never went on strike. Never had to, but his wages were docked every week for strike benefits for other areas where there were strikes. So the union took care of their own. I mean, it didn't make them rich, but they did take care of their own. And one effect of having steady employment was that I never knew what it was to be hungry. I mean, we always had food on the table, a decent place to live, and so on. And if you weren't unionized, believe me, you didn't. Other as usual. Charles Dana wrote about the Linotype machine, the Mergenthaler. Now, my father in the 1880s, I may have told you this, but I'll tell you again, he learned his trade on the Linotype machine, and he was one of a rare sort of a rare bird, because the other were what he called handmen, and they still had them way up in the time when I was a young man, that there were certain things on a newspaper that could only be set by a handman. In other words, more efficient to use hand setting a type than the Mergenthaler machine, or hand printing. And anyway, he learned his trade on that, and was working that way until he died in 1936. He, for some time, worked as a proofreader on the paper also. He only had a 5th grade education, but he had read, he loved the unabridged dictionary. He'd ask him a word, he'd give you the definition, usually without looking it up. In fact, on our street was a nice street. The Custer area was a nice block. It was middle class. It's not upper or lower, just middle class. We had some men who had good white-collar jobs, salesmen, but there are a lot of men who have disappeared now as far as their occupation. They were skilled mechanics, men who had learned a trade as an apprentice and then worked at it. As a grown man, and were respected for what they knew and what they did. Tool makers, die makers, machinists. Men like my father on the newspaper, operating one of the Mergenthaler machines. Incidentally, I think I told you this. When he went on as he apprenticed at the Oswego Palladium, which is now Oswego, New York, which is now the Oswego something Palladium. The paper's still in existence. And the Mergenthaler Linotype machine was just getting started, and most of the printers printed by were handmen, as they call them. I've forgotten that little thing they had for picking up a big font of type and doing this with it and that with it. And my father learned that, but he also one of the first persons to learn to operate the Linotype, and he did that, other than a short stint of proofreading, for the rest of his life. My brother Robert, incidentally, was a makeup man. I don't know if there's such a thing in a newspaper anymore or not. In other words, he made up the pages from the type. ads, I mean, set everything up, you know, ads and all that. He stood at a desk with a tilted top and did all those things. My father, of course, operated a linotype machine. And his trade is not gone, or they mean the linotype. That's the thing of the past. So he saw almost the whole of that phase of the newspaper business. But again, he and my brother could talk shop by the hour. But the newspaper men then, particularly mechanical men, they floated around. The man would have his job safe, but he would want to take some time off, and there were always printers, capable men, who were signed up as extras, and that would give them a day's work. And of course, the other guy would lose a day's work, but he had other plans or something. That's what he'd do. Sometimes they'd go off for months and still hold their jobs. One friend of my father's was a famous baseball scout, Larry, for the Brooklyn Dodgers, Larry Sutton. And he'd go up months at a time. I think finally he quit, but near the end of his career. But he would go up for months at a time. Somebody would hold his job, and then when he came back, the other guy would have to give it up. But by that time, he was probably far enough along on the list so that he was either due to get a regular job or had already gotten it. They were quite a guild. Fine bunch of men.